All right, folks. Well, as we come near the end of the semester, what I'd like to talk about today is two important systems in living organisms dealing with communication. And by this, I mean if you had a single cell, everything that goes inside the cell that's important for maintaining homeostasis can sort of easily be controlled at a molecular level because everything's in kind of a small area. But as an organism becomes bigger in size and you have more and more cells, for example, let's say you have your hand, in order for cells in your hand to maintain homeostasis and take care of things like injury or too high of temperature, you need a system or a set of systems to communicate what's going on at the cellular level with the organism as a whole. So that's what we're going to talk about today as we talk about the nervous system and the endocrine system. And first of all, I'll start by kind of comparing sort of the difference between the two of them. So both of them essentially are used for allowing one group of cells or a single cell to communicate from a distance to another set of cells or another group of cells. Okay, so we have the nervous system, first of all, which generally, in terms of how quick it can happen, is usually very fast. So as you probably know, your nervous system has a very fast response to things. If you were to grab, for example, an iron and it was really, really hot, you would very quickly let go of that because it's your nervous system involved in sensing that extreme change in temperature, and your nervous system responsible for making your hand open enough to let go of it. Okay, in terms of speed, in contrast, the endocrine system tends to be fairly slow. So, for example, as you start off as a young child and as you grow in size, one of the important hormones involved with that is a hormone called growth hormone. And it releases it as you grow, and it causes your cells to go through cell division like mitosis, causes your bones to grow, and all of those things take long periods of time, and so are generally slow in their response. They don't happen in seconds or milliseconds. In terms of the range of the area affected, nervous system tends to be pretty localized, meaning you send a nerve impulse from one end of a cell and it reaches, say, to your finger. So when you move your fingers or your arm, it's localized to that area. It's not moving your entire body. Whereas something like growth hormone, once again, in the endocrine system is generally widespread. So it's going to be secreted by one group of cells, but it's actually going to target quite often a large group of cells. And then in terms of the duration, how long it happens, nervous system tends to be very short. So if you want to continue the nervous response, you have to send another nerve impulse or another action potential we'll talk about. So it's generally short. It's designed to be really quick, but short-lived, whereas the endocrine system takes a while usually to get going, but then its effects tend to last for a lot longer. Okay, so those are sort of some differences between the two systems. We'll first start talking about the nervous system, and there are sort of two categories of cells when we talk about the nervous system. There's the neurons, which we'll spend most of our time talking about, but then there's also these cells called the glial cells. And the glial cells are kind of like the glue. So they're responsible for sort of cleaning the neurons. Often they'll form these specialized coverings, these myelin sheaths that help the axons stay sort of insulated and allow the electrical signal to move through. They also will help maintain sort of the health of the neuron. They'll clean it. They're responsible for forming the blood-brain barrier so that certain chemicals don't get to your neurons and damage them. So those are the glial cells. And then at a functional level, We're mainly going to talk about the neurons because those are the ones that actually send and receive the impulses. So a neuron is essentially a cell. So it's a single cell, and it's an odd-shaped cell. And so what you'll notice is one part of the cell, and there's a lot of variations on these, actually. So I'm going to sort of show you one generalized kind of neuron, but realize there's many different sort of shapes to them. But this is, a kind of standard shape. And what you'll notice is these little finger-like projections, and those are called the dendrites. And the dendrites are the receptive end of the neuron. They receive the information. And surrounding it, if you look at this picture here of this neuron, you'll see it's sort of yellow, but it has sort of a black outline. The black outline is, like in any cell, is the cell membrane. Okay, so if you remember back when we talked about the phospholipid bilayer, that's essentially what that black line is. So it's a group of phospholipids along with proteins and so forth, and that's what the black line is here. So it's essentially cell membrane material covering the entire cell, including the dendrite. So you have the dendrites right there. Then you have this area here called the cell body, or also it's called the soma, and it's where the nucleus and other parts of the neuron are at. Inside the neuron, other parts of the cell. And then we have this sort of funnel-shaped portion called the axon hillock, and that leads then from there in down to the axon. And the axon's quite often the longest part of the cell. So this is the axon here, and so the electrical signal is going to travel down the axon, and it's going to come all the way down here to the end of this cell, and this end of the cell is called the synaptic terminal. You'll also see it as the synaptic knobs, and there's a couple different names for it, but that's the end of the cell. And then what will happen is that one cell, that one neuron, will either meet another neuron or a gland or a muscle, and where those two meet, that little interaction area is called a synapse, where the two come together. So in this case, you actually see two different neurons here, and we'll talk about that a little more also. The next thing to talk about is now that we talked about the basic structure of a neuron, if you were to take a neuron, they can do this now, it's quite sophisticated, and they've been doing this a long time, and it's really interesting, but you can take basically a voltmeter, like the same kind of voltmeter used to measure, say, the electricity or the voltage in a battery or in your wall, and you can put one end of the probe inside of a cell, and you can put the other end on the outside of the cell, and you can measure the difference, the voltage difference in a cell. And what you tend to find out is the inside of a neuron during the resting potential, which is when the neuron is essentially not doing anything, just sitting there. At that point, when it's not firing, it's the resting potential. The inside's slightly negative, and different neurons vary, but usually we symbolize it and say it's about minus 70 millivolts. And the way it becomes negative during the resting potential is that there's a couple things going on. First of all, there's a protein that's involved in an active transport, and it's called the sodium-potassium pump. And what it does essentially is it uses ATP, which is a source of energy, and it uses the ATP to harness the protein and the energy that it can deliver from the ATP to take 3 sodium ions, and 2 potassium ions, and it moves 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions that it moves in. So sodium ions are positively charged, as you can see right there. So they are ions that have lost an electron, and so they therefore have one more proton than they do electrons. And same thing kind of with the potassium, it's also positively charged like that. So what happens is you're pumping 3 positive things out for every 2 positive things in. 3 positive sodiums out of the cell for 2 positive potassiums inside the cell. And you also have proteins and other things in here that tend to be slightly negative, but this sodium-potassium pump really has a really big impact on that. Then you also have these channel proteins here, and here they're just shown as an arrow, but there's also channel proteins in here that can be opened and closed. And if they're open, of course, the sodium would come in and the potassium would mainly come out because of the difference in concentration. Because as you pump a bunch of sodium out and a bunch of potassium in, as they randomly move around, the chances that the potassium is going to move out tends to be greater than it moving in. Once again, I'd like to point out it's not that the potassium wants to move out of the cell, which is kind of what a lot of people sort of envision it as. Remember, there's sodium atoms and there's potassium atoms, and they they don't want to do anything. They just simply are moving from high concentration to low, mainly because it's random. So if you put a whole bunch of sodium ions out here, the chances that one's going to move in tend to be greater than them moving out, just because of the odds of you putting more of them out. Okay, so anyway, you measure that, it's about minus 70 millivolts. Now, what ends up happening is, once again, to get to the resting potential, what happens during the resting potential is the neuron tends to be somewhere around, depending on the neuron, but around minus 70 millivolts. And so if you look at this graph here, and I'll show you this up closer here in a second, what's happening during the resting potential is you have the sodium-potassium pumping essentially your 3 sodiums out, right? And your 2 potassiums in. And you have the sodium and potassium channels closed. But what you'll notice is that's during the resting potential. But what happens is, depending on the kind of neuron, different stimuli can allow the sodium channels to start opening. And what happens is, as long as it stays below some certain threshold, in this particular neuron they're showing you that threshold's about minus 50 millivolts. As long as you stay below that, you get the resting potential again. But what happens is, if enough sodium channels open, what happens is you get a whole bunch of sodium channels opening very, very rapidly. And what happens then is the sodium channels, as they open, the sodium comes rushing into the cell very, very quickly. And so the cell goes from a negative state not only to 0, but it actually goes to a positive state. And then those sodium channels close, and then the sodium-potassium pump kicks in and starts pumping the sodium back out and the potassium back in, and that drives it back down. And that quick little phase there, you see it says time down here, that's measured in milliseconds. So not even a second, but milliseconds. That happens very, very quick. It can happen, many times in a single second. So it's really, really quick, the action potential, and then it goes back to the resting potential once again. And that action potential, again, is caused primarily by the influx of sodium. That has the biggest effect on that. The influx of sodium, the opening of the sodium channels causes the sodium to come rushing into the cell, and that causes the action potential. So we have the resting potential and then the action potential. And the action potential is when the neuron's actually firing. Okay? So once again, this just shows you up sort of closer here. Here's your threshold at about minus 50 millivolts. Here's the regular state of the neuron at the resting potential. Probably right around minus 70 millivolts tends to be pretty common. And then once you get to a certain point, once you reach that threshold, sodium channels open very quickly, and then they close right after that. They open very quickly, and it starts on one end. It starts on the dendrite end, and it moves through the cell body down to the axon, essentially, all the way to the axon terminal very, very quickly, and then it fades off very quickly and goes back to the resting potential. Now, that's essentially talking about one neuron. So there, what we've talked about is how one neuron can send an electrical impulse from one end to the dendrite down very quickly to the other end, which is the synaptic terminal. But now what we want to talk about is if you have this one neuron here, how does this one neuron communicate to another neuron? So what happens here, this is sort of a close-up. If I took sort of just this section here, where this synaptic terminal ended on the end of this dendrite, this is kind of what you would see. So as the action potential comes down and reaches this end, and it becomes positive over here, once again, this is cell membrane material right here. So essentially a cell membrane, okay, material, phospholipid bilayer. Inside the end of that synaptic terminal are a whole bunch of these vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters then will fuse to the cell membrane, and through exocytosis, this is where you start to see kind of all that stuff come back that we've used once before in cell biology. We talked about cells and about movement of molecules, so that's what you're seeing here. And those neurotransmitters, when they fuse, those vesicles fuse, they're also made out of phospholipid bilayer material. They fuse, those neurotransmitters then go over and they bind to receptors that are on the next neuron. So the presynaptic neuron is the first neuron. Then there's the synapse. This is the synapse where these two meet. The space between the synapse is called the synaptic cleft. So this is a little tiny space where those neurotransmitters travel across, and then they bind to receptors on this side. That then can cause a new action potential in the neuron after that, the postsynaptic neuron. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Now, it turns out that when a neuron meets another neuron, there's a couple of things it can do. It can be inhibitory or it can be excitatory. So when a neuron comes down and meets another neuron, whatever neurotransmitters it releases, it turns out that there are different kinds of neurotransmitters, several different types of neurotransmitters. I believe, in fact, now they've discovered something like over 200 of them. And some of them are very, very common ones that we know quite a bit about, others not as much about. So these neurotransmitters have different effects. Some of them are inhibitory, some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory in some places, but tend to be excitatory in others. And what that simply means is if they're excitatory, that means that they tend to cause the next neuron to become depolarized. So one neuron might send an action potential, and it might cause a slight increase in the threshold potential, reaching that threshold, but it might not be quite enough to cause the action potential in another. Others can be inhibitory, where they actually lower the threshold. So your nervous system is sort of this balancing and play between the excitatory and inhibitory neurons working with each other to sort of create a series of neurons firing or not firing at certain times. And that sort of creates sort of the whole picture of what we're going to talk about as we talk about the brain. Another way we can look at neurons is basically on where their information is going. Motor neurons typically are motor neurons we talk about are things that are carrying information away from the CNS. The CNS is the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. Oops, I went too far. So the brain and the spinal cord, those are your CNS. All right, so if you say send a action potential out to move your pencil, those are motor neurons going from your brain down your spinal cord to work or operate your arm. Sensory neurons carry information back. So once again, like if you grab the hot iron I mentioned before, it is sensory information from neurons in your fingers or in your hand that sends the information back to your CNS, which is your brain or spinal cord. And then inner neurons are essentially in between those, between your motor and your sensory neurons. This is primarily the kind of neurons your brain and spinal cord are made out of, because they're doing all the communicating between the motor parts and the sensory parts. Okay? Now, the next thing we can do is we can look at a brain, and a brain is essentially a collection of a whole bunch of these neurons and their glial cells, the ones that hold them together. And different brains and different parts of the brain do different things because of the neurons that they have there. So first of all, we can talk about the cerebrum, which is the largest part in the human brain. And the cerebrum is all this that you see right up here. And the cerebrum is primarily involved with everything that makes you human. So your ability to speak, your ability to learn languages and do math and art, all that higher level thinking types of things are primarily involved with your cerebrum. We have one of the largest cerebrums per body size of any animal on the planet right now, and that allows us to learn things and build tools and learn from each other and so forth. So it's a complex portion of the brain, but again, essentially it's what makes humans so different from many other animals. Okay, the next part I'll mention is the cerebellum. That's located sort of in the back portion here. The cerebellum is involved with coordinated body movements. So it for example, your cerebrum is very heavily involved with, like when you learn to ride a bike or you walk upstairs, the first step that you take or the first pedal on a bike, that initial movement is controlled by your primary motor cortex, which is a part of your cerebrum. But after that, the balancing on the bike and the continued movement up the stairs, those coordinated body movements are mainly the result of your cerebellum. When you do martial arts or you learn dance moves, a lot of times if you get sort of stuck and you can't maybe remember it in your head, if you start moving, you have sort of this built-in muscle memory that will help you sort of remember the other parts of a dance sequence or in martial arts. So those are largely coordinated by your cerebellum. Then you have your thalamus here. Your thalamus sort of regulates, and you notice that this portion here is sort of moved out. So this is sort of in the middle of your brain here. Your brain surrounds all this right here. So the thalamus up here helps control what moves up to other portions of the brain. So it acts as sort of a filter as to what's going to move on to other portions of the cerebrum. The hypothalamus down here is mainly controlled or helps control hunger, thirst, and aggression, and a bunch of very primitive types of things. And a large portion of the impact that the hypothalamus has actually has on this little gland right here. So if this is a person's brain here, their eyes would be right about here, like that. So this would be a side view, and their nose then, would be, it's kind of hard to draw. The nose would be somewhere like maybe there or something like that, and they'd be looking this direction. Okay, so just to sort of, or this would be the back right here, like that. That's their neck. I can't draw, and it's even harder with something like that. There's their mouth. There you go. That's horrible. But anyway, that's where essentially the pituitary gland sits right there. And the pituitary gland is primarily controlled by the hypothalamus. And the pituitary gland has a very big role really in the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about that portion later on. Then you have the midbrain right here. And then below that, the pons and the medulla oblongata. The pons is very important for regulating breathing, for example. And your medulla also involved with breathing. When you talk about breathing, I mean your sort of involuntary breathing, when you're just sort of breathing like when you sleep or when you're not thinking about it. Also controls your heart rate, things like that. It's important for blood pressure, and things of that sort. So this portion down here, if you were to suffer an injury, let's say you're riding a motorcycle or a bike, or you fall off your roof or whatever, injuring your brain, depending on where you say you break your neck. If you break your neck, say down here, you end up being paralyzed, say, from the neck down. But it turns out as you go a little bit higher, it gets worse. And as you get up into this region up here, depending on how much you damage the pons and the medulla, you end up having trouble breathing on your own and controlling your heart rate and things like that. Also, just to show you sort of a simple version of how the system can be sort of wired together, I'll show you this reflex here that I'm sure you've all had done before. But when you go to the doctor, one of the things they do is they'll check your reflexes. And what they'll do is they hit your patellar ligament here with this rubber hammer. And what that does is it stretches this muscle really quickly here. And what happens is you have this built-in stretch receptor in many of your muscles, and in your quadriceps you have one, because if you were to stretch that muscle really fast and a long way, you could damage or tear the muscle. So what ends up happening is by hitting this, you stretch the muscle very quick, but it only goes a short distance. The stretch receptor is a sensory receptor that essentially sends that impulse down to the back of your spinal cord. So this is your spinal cord. This would be the back, like the back portion of your back. Your stomach would be here. And this is like if you cut your, say you cut your shoulders off and you look down into the spinal cord, that's what you see. All your sensory information comes in through the back. And then that is hardwired to a motor neuron that goes out to that, motor neuron goes out to that muscle, causing it to contract, because the opposite of stretching that is to contract that, and so that's why your leg moves during that response. What's not shown in the picture here is this neuron actually will interface, in addition to synapsing with the motor neuron and sensory neuron, it'll interface to an inner neuron, and it will travel up the brain so that you're aware of that as well. But you don't have to think about moving your leg with your brain in order to get your leg to move like that. And the same thing happens if you grab a hot iron. You will let go of the iron with your spinal cord, with your reflexes, whether your brain's conscious of it or not. Okay? The next system, as I was saying, is the endocrine system. And what happens in the endocrine system is one group of cells makes chemicals such as hormones, and those hormones then enter the blood, and they travel through the blood, and they are carried, and they target certain cells. And when they target those cells, they cause the effects in those cells, either for them to grow or for them to secrete certain hormones, other hormones, and things like that. So a endocrine system and a hormone is essentially a hormone or a chemical that's produced by one group of cells, travels in the bloodstream, and it targets another group of cells somewhere else. And we can divide hormones into two types: steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are things like testosterone and estrogen, and as steroid hormones, they're able to actually go right inside the cell, and they can go through the phospholipid bilayer, and they can target something inside the cell. A non-steroid hormone has to bind to some receptor on the outside of the cell, and then through a series of reactions they can get that cell to make a new protein product or stop producing something. And as I was saying before, the real big powerhouse of the endocrine system is this pituitary gland right here, and it can be divided up really three ways, but we'll talk about sort of the main two right here. So once again, if this was a person, their eyes would be right about there, their nose would be somewhere in there like that, and they would be looking this direction. And so that's where the pituitary gland sits. This would be the back of their head over here, and it would be like that, although it cut a large portion of the brain off. But anyway, what ends up happening is we'll start by this back portion, which is called the posterior pituitary gland. And that secretes two important hormones I want to tell you about. One of them is ADH, and the other is oxytocin. ADH primarily targets the kidneys, and what it does is high levels of ADH causes your collecting tubes to the collecting ducts to reabsorb water out of them. Remember that in the kidney, any water that stays in the collecting duct, so if you going through your kidney on the last step there, you have your water inside there. Any water that stays in here is going to eventually go down to your urinary bladder and go out the urethra. So any water that your body wants to keep needs to come out of there. Okay? ADH, when you're dehydrated, your body will release more ADH, and that will allow you to collect more of that water out. Alcohol, when you drink alcohol, if you do, one of the things alcohol does to make you feel so crummy the next day is it blocks the effects of ADH. So what ends up happening is you have very low levels of ADH functioning on your collecting duct. Then you end up urinating out all your water and you become dehydrated. So high levels of ADH allow you to normally keep water, take it out of the collecting duct, put it back into your blood supply. Oxytocin targets the prostate gland in males, and in females it targets the uterus and the mammary glands. And this is particularly of interest because this is oxytocin is what they can give you during labor to increase uterine contractions to push the baby out. Oxytocin is normally released by your posterior pituitary gland. High levels of that will increase the contractions, and you can give birth quicker. Whether that's good or bad, I'll leave up to you. The next is the anterior pituitary gland. So look at that up here next, and several hormones there. I won't go through all of these here. I'll just talk about a couple of them. First of all, thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so the anterior pituitary gland releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which functions to travel in the blood, and it targets the thyroid gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone causes the thyroid gland to release more thyroid hormone. Your thyroid gland, which sits in your neck, kind of right above your trachea there, your thyroid gland, when it releases thyroid hormone, tends to increase your metabolism. So, high levels, if you're hyperthyroid, you tend to have a higher metabolic rate, and therefore you'll be burning more calories. Things like exercise tend to increase your levels of thyroid hormone. Normally, you can also have medical conditions where your thyroid gland is functioning abnormally. It can be very, very high or very, very low. Low levels of thyroid hormone would be hypothyroidism, and low levels of that tend to have a low effect on lowering your metabolic rate, which tends to mean you'll burn less calories over time. Growth hormone, I already mentioned to you, growth hormone is involved in growth. So as you grow, as you go, say from a child, to an adult, growth hormone being released throughout your young adult life allows you to have your bones and muscles and other tissues increase. One of the things that happens if you have a child that maybe isn't hitting certain growth marks, maybe they're shorter than on average, or their bone length isn't. They have shorter arms or legs than what you would expect. Every now and then you'll hear about doctors suggesting maybe we should put them on a supplement of growth hormone to speed that up, because once you become an adult, it's very tough once your bones sort of solidify and are no longer growing. They don't respond well to growth hormone at that point, and so sometimes that's an issue. That's again one of those personal choices that some people make and others don't. Okay, I'll just mention this quickly here because we'll see these later on. Again, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone causes in males the follicles to develop, which are basically making sperm, and in females, follicle stimulating hormone helps the egg develop in the ovaries. So follicle stimulating hormone, the follicles end up being the sperm in the case of males and the eggs in the case of females. And then luteinizing hormone, or LH, is responsible for, in males, primarily producing testosterone, and in females producing estrogen and progesterone, which we'll also talk about when we do the male and female reproductive tract coming up next week.